Thank you very much for being here. This is the fourth lecture in the context of Pride Queer Studies in 2022. The subject I have chosen is transphobia rising within the left movement and in feminism. And we have two guests. Today, Stipe Nogalo from Croatia, who will say more about him. And Jovan Džoli Ulićević from Montenegro, who will also say a little bit more about him. I only have to note one thing, is that I couldn't remember his middle name, Džoli. Yeah, I always thought it was Johnny. And then I realized, oh my God, I'm so depressed because Džoli means joyful, and I can't accept that somebody is joyful at all. Thank you, Džoli, for being joyful, and please introduce yourself and start with your little exposés. Thank you.
Okay, well,
You start?
but people, just for the record, people mostly know me by Džoli and not by Jovan. So, I'm a trans activist based in Montenegro. I always state this, that I'm a trans activist because I think that it's important, but I think that majority of my activism is much broader than that, and that is why I usually prefer to speak about joint movements and solidarity. So when Dušan asked me to speak about TransFeminist, my first reaction was like, why would I speak about TransFeminist? And I must say that I used to have an attitude that we should not speak so much about the movement, which is not so numbered, but very vocal and well coordinated. But now I think differently. I think that it is necessary to speak about the TERF movement, to shed a light on the movement, to analyze it a lot in the context of the anti-gender movement, which is strengthening literally everywhere. But also I suggested to Dušan that I speak more today about some opportunities in regards to feminist solidarity, and maybe some examples which I think are very relevant and maybe useful and have a certain potential, I think, in the region, especially because we're speaking about post-socialist heritage and context, which is also very important for me. Just to state also some other things, I do not come with a lot of data and a lot of analysis. I come with experience and from different movements and from different occasions where I had the opportunity to actually contribute to building this feminist solidarity, and maybe contribute to some, I believe, very important shifts which happened in specific places where there was a potential of including trans people in these movements. So basically, I'm a storyteller. For me, it's important also to give a brief overview of, from my position as an activist, on how I see the anti-gender movement and the position of the TERF movement within it. Especially because I think that, you probably have much more data than me in this regards, but I think that the anti-gender movement has not been researched properly in the region. Now we have some data, we have data and research on narratives and different actors in different countries, I think especially Croatia and Serbia. But we see now the strengthening of the movement throughout the whole region. And what is very interesting for me is that we have some data on the money flow which goes to the anti-gender movement, but not a lot of data on the money flow which goes to the anti-gender movement in our region. And I think that's also very very interesting. Why I say this? Because I have. It's water now. I do not like to claim things that I don't know for fact, but I think that it's also important to speak about these things and unofficial data that comes to us as activists, academics, on the TERV movement. So I think the question is where to position the TERV movement in the broader anti-gender movement, and I believe that you will give us some answers to that. But what I want to say is that I have unofficial information from several sources throughout the Europe that some parts of the TERV movement are financed by the same actors which are financing the anti-gender movement. And I think this is very important to have in mind. When we speak about the TERV movement, I think it's also very important to be cautious what we call the TERV movement or TERVs. Because from my experience, I know that there are some people who have a very clear agenda on using trans rights for their own political purposes, including the ones in the TERV movement. But I also know that there is a big portion of people who have a lot of anxiety on because of the attacks on gender from different anti-gender actors. And I think that sometimes it's a very thin line, and it's very sometimes it's very hard to be very clear and concrete. When is it a part of some sort of the political agenda, and when is it a result of different anxieties coming from these very coordinated attacks on everything that we accomplished, not only in terms of gender equality, but I think democracy and social justice, because the ultimate goal of these movements is actually undermining all what was accomplished in the field of in social justice and democracy. I think there is a very interesting fact about the event which is happening in Berlin this weekend. So we have Europride here, and in Berlin there is an organized walk which is pro-family, pro-life walk, but at the same time these same actors are organizing a conference. You heard about Citizen Go, that is one of the major anti-gender actors on a global level. They're organizing a conference on which is basically speaking about trans ideology and attacking trans human rights in order to accomplish their own agendas. So to summarize it a bit, and to move on the part on solidarity, because I have 15 minutes and timekeeping is a feminist practice.
Huge watch.
Yes. The reason why we started thinking about connecting different movements, actually there are several reasons on why we started doing that. One is a very personal reason. I am one of the many trans people who are very invested in leftist movements, anti-fascist movements, who want to be more invested in these movements, peace movements. And also one of the many people who were not an integral part of these movements because either transphobia in them or the lack of understanding of trans issues, because we usually take a role of like constant educators, like, hi, I'm Džoli, I'm a trans people, and then you become a book. Which is exhausting because then you cannot invest yourself in all the issues where you can contribute. The other one is, I think, also a very personal but also a very political issue is that I think that many people, including me, are very tired of the narrative trans people for trans rights. I generally think that this narrative is damaging to all social justice movements, like queer people for queer rights, and this whole concept of a right of one group, women for women's rights, and using these identity boxes. And just to state, I think that identity is very, very important, and I'm very proud. I'm very proud on all identities that I claim, but I also think that this kind of narrative was pushing us in being invested only in one battle. And when I speak with trans people and I ask them what is very important to them, they usually say many things which are not only connected to them being trans. So, for example, in Montenegro, we were a part of the 8th of March, then anti-corruption protests, protests for the protection of the environment, protests for the independent public broadcaster, and all these different protests where we found that we can contribute. So when I see many like global reports speaking about the role of trans people in society, there is always this narrative like trans people are fighting for body autonomy of trans people. They are fighting for depathologization of trans people. And I think that this kind of narrative is also not recognizing enough the agency of trans people in social justice movements. So these were like main reasons why we started thinking about solidarity and actually being more involved in different movements. And of course, I would always say that I have an attitude that the ones who have more resources are responsible for spreading space or spaces for those who do not have these resources. But this is not our reality. So we're basically getting into spaces and spreading them from the inside. And there are several very good examples when we were invited in spaces, and also examples where we, in a way, penetrated spaces to spread them. And I would like to briefly speak and conclude. We will have, I believe, a good discussion on this. I think that, as I said, there are many good examples. I'm not sure how visible they are. Like, for example, a left feminist book club, which is organized on a regional level, or Antifa School, which was organized by Rosa Luxemburg, or Center for Women's Education, which organized the digital feminist school and included trans people as lecturers. But one opportunity is particularly important for me, and that is the opportunity of being involved in the network of Women in Black. And I think that event was groundbreaking here, and I will explain briefly why. Several trans-led organizations from the region started the TransFeminist Platform. And this is actually the first time that I'm publicly speaking about it, and this was intentionally. We actually wanted to go low-key with it and contact feminists from countries in the region to become involved in the platform, and then start to make it publicly, because at the beginning we were afraid of the preservation of a safe space. Anyways, at one moment I was invited by Women in Black to be a part of the whole trans day in their agenda, because, as you know, in Serbia there was a strong debate on, and I think that it's still ongoing, the strong debate of the inclusion of trans people in feminist spaces. And I said yes very quickly, but that is something that I do. I usually say yes to many things that I see as an opportunity, and then I think afterwards, is this a good actually opportunity to address some things or not? And I can say that that whole event was not organized perfectly, and this is very important. I would organize it completely in a completely different way. For example, there was a session of, literally a session Trans 101. And for that session, I think that it's deeply wrong to be organized, actually to be conducted by someone who is not trans. That is my political stance. But then again, I think that it was a good opportunity to address some prejudices coming from people who are not trans and who are constantly lecturing about trans people, and also to learn from each other and to be open to a critique which is not malicious, because I think that in social justice movements oftentimes we come from a I think that majority of us do it, I also do it, we come from a very moralistic and superior position that my values are the only values which are right. And I think that we should not relativize many things, but also I think that the space for discussion is much bigger than we think. I think that day was a huge emotional work, and we literally had, I think, 70 people of whom majority didn't know anything about trans people, but who were very willing to listen. We literally debated with people who are against inclusion of trans people in feminism, which is also something that I don't think it's a good format of discussing these issues. But I also think that it was a very good opportunity to see live, not on social networks where this discussion is usually happening, but actually to see live the complete difference of values between these two movements, and I think that made a huge change amongst many people who are part of that network who didn't know a lot on trans issues. And let me conclude with this, because timekeeping is a feminist practice. I think that that kind of opportunity also shown me that there are really concrete anxieties coming from the feminist movement on what will happen with everything that we did so far if we include you. And I actually really like the moderation, which was facilitation, which was done by Stasha Zajević, because at one moment at the end she said, okay, Žuc, Women in Black, organize this now. We are not going to organize it again. We are done with this. Trans people are a part of the peace feminist movement. If you need more opportunities to debate, organize it yourself. And I think that was a very good example of taking responsibility to do something and open a space and have a very difficult task in facilitating all this, to do it not perfectly, but to do it good enough to have a significant result. And I can say that if you speak with trans people from Serbia now, maybe with someone from Talas, you will see that people feel change in being included in the movement. I know for a fact that a trans feminine person was invited to speak about healthcare, not only from a position of a trans person, but also from a position of a class struggle. And I think that was very important. Yeah, that's it.
Well, I should start with introducing myself, obviously. Where to start? Well, probably with my name. My name is Stipe Nogalo, and usually how do I call it? I'm an educator in a feminist organization which functions in Zagreb, Croatia, where most of my work is based upon working on gender topics with, not exclusively, but specifically men. So that's a kind of interesting specific from my work, and most of my work is done with high school children or with people who would like to do similar work with me, as me. And I'll finish my introduction with just the thing that I wrote about myself when sending Dusan papers. I consider myself an activist. I'm a sociologist, philosopher, and educator, and a communist. So I think those are the things that are kind of important to know about me. I mean, I'm not a boring person, but I'm really bad at introducing myself. Where should I start? My idea was to put this whole discussion into a political and historical context that we're seeing here and we're living through. So the starting point that I wanted to, timekeeping, just a second. Just to remember how much time do I have. As I presume that I don't have to explain to you who are TERFs and what are TERFs, but my starting point here is that transphobia is not a new phenomenon. We know it from different parts of history, from different contexts, from European colonization to the Nazis burning the Institute for Sexualwissenschaft to the 70s and stuff like that. But the question is, I think the historical context is, the question here is, why is it visible again? Why is it coming to the forefront? Why is it a hot topic at this time? And I think a few things, which I'll come back to it, maybe not explain it right now, is the context of that we're still living in an economic crisis that started in 2008. We're still living inside of those austerity politics, and we're still feeling like the world went to shit and it didn't get better from 2008. Another context, which you made a good introduction from it, we still live in sexist societies. I think that's a thing that's going to help us explain a lot of this. And the thing also, which connects to the first two, is when economic crises happen, there's always, as we know, there's always scapegoating. And in the last few decades, we've seen different scapegoatings from Jews, Muslims, queer people, women. You have all those narratives of who is at fault for societal decline or some type of stuff. And also what you already mentioned is it's also part of a backlash for already fought for rights. So some rights were fought for, were gotten, and then there's a backlash for it. So I wanted to go through a few things. Like you kind of put me in a weird spot because I wasn't going in any like data position. I'm going from a more like a theoretical here position. I was thinking about like to go through some nominal values, nominal views, nominal stuff that TERFs do believe. And I think that the discussion constantly goes to the position of the centrality of transphobia and their beliefs. And I think that is emphasized and a huge part of it, but I think there are a lot of things that under it exist, which explain their visibility, explain some of the anxieties that we talked about, and explain like why those positions aren't valuable for us from the left perspective, if you consider yourself to the left, and why are those positions like detrimental to our society, why they don't help. So the first thing that I wanted to start is and you'll hear it constantly, like sex-based rights, the erasure of sex and stuff like that. There's a centrality of the idea of biological sex constantly coming back into that the TERF discourse comes back to constantly. It's almost like one of the most central points in their beliefs. So the concept that they present is, it's not biological. Like when it comes to, my point is that even knowledge is not going to help us here. All of this is about power, but still, from the perspective of biology, their concept of sex isn't valid, but their concept of sex is the status quo concept, the binary, self-evident, totally self-contained, totally different from each other. There are two sexes which are totally pulled apart from each other. They're distinct. So that concept of sex is constantly going through all of those discussions. So then you have again, from that position, you have the ideas of sex-based rights, or the ideas of even talking about gender is erasure of the concept of sex and stuff like that. And on top of that, the idea that they espouse is something like the abolition of gender. In a sense, but in a sense that that abolition of gender, how I see it, is not an abolition of like power relations that we have and we see them as gender. It's usually in the discussions and the texts that I've read and that I've seen and stuff like that. The idea of abolition of gender is the abolition of the concept, the epistemological concept which we see society through, not those power relations. Or when they say that there is those power relations, again, that's a step back to the concept of just biological sex as they envision it. So from that, I think there are different areas, I think, where those ideas go. So there's the idea of I wrote it here, but it's I think it could be easier to explain it a different way. There's the idea of violence, where we talk about when we're talking about political positions, when we're talking about feminism, we constantly have to go back to the idea of violence. And with the ideas that you hear from the TERF movement about sex and how violence functions, violence is like a trans-historical fact of biology in that sense, because violence is constantly put in the position of a biological fact. Like, we all know probably that most of the interpersonal physical violence is something that men do. But the ideas that we go through when we talk about TERFs, when it comes to violence, the ideas seems like that violence comes from the fact that men have penises and have testosterone, which removes totally the whole social and historical positions and origins of what we would call gender-based violence through history and in our time right now. And then also, that type of idea of biological sex is, interestingly enough, it's really heteronormative when we talk about it, when we see it when we see how it functions inside of TERF discourse. Because I mean, if we want to go through some of their stated fears, if you imagine the idea of the trans woman entering a female bathroom, it's always presented that is, coming back to the biological idea of violence, that is a man with a penis there coming to do violence to a woman. So that, again, that kind of violence is constantly being put under the idea of a type of sexual violence, which is, again, heteronormative. It presumes that, it presumes the transphobic idea that trans women are men, and it also presumes that men are inherently heterosexual in that area. So there's you can see the discourse short circuit when you consider trans lesbians, because in that kind of view of seeing sex, there's no place for that kind of type. And also, again, the heteronormative, as I called it, heteronormative reproductive matrix, which comes from that type of idea of sex. Women are constantly seen as the capacity for reproduction. the constantly going back to the idea as women as a biological fact, which is constantly again pulled back as the capacity for reproduction. Women are people who can give birth. That's the idea, like you can hear constantly, and it's the idea of that biological sex. And again, in those in those concepts, you can see this sexuality presented as like a monosexuality, which is fixated exclusively on genitals. That's as an example, as we talked about already, that from their perspective, like trans lesbian woman doesn't exist, because sexuality is inherently fixated on genitals in this view. So my position here was to go and talk about the social construction of sex, and going back to the sex and gender, and also I'll come back to the context that we talked about, I talked about, to be honest. I hope we talk later. So one of the positions that views that I wanted to talk about is from the perspective of social reproductive theory, where gender is constantly in our society related to the division of work, which we constantly see here. That's one of the ways that gender is constructed in our societies. The ideas of women as housewives who do reproductive work, and men as the proletariat going outside of the house, the breadwinners, the breadwinner model, as we would call it. And that type of thinking goes away if we consider just sex as the basis of discrimination, which TERFs constantly talk about. The only, I forgot to mention, but a lot of TERFs, from my experience, when you ask them like their base position, a lot of them say that they're left-wing, a lot of them call themselves Marxist, but they consider the basic conflict is a conflict of sex. Again, a conflict of sex as a biological fact, as a noun, not as a verb. And it puts sex as a trans-historical fact, which doesn't have its history, doesn't have its powers around it. It's just that men use and violate women because they're biologically like that. So when we consider it from the position of like social reproductive theory and where gender comes in, and how different societal structures come to form our ideas of gender, of ourselves, of our positions in society, we kind of go away from that essentialist position of sex. You reminded me when we were talking about like the post-socialist experience. One of my favorite books that I read was from Liljana Burcal. It's basically about, again, from the position of social reproductive theory, is the position on how in post-socialist societies in Yugoslavia, the construction of gender started anew. Again, we got the re-traditionalized gender positions, which were structural. The first things that happened after Yugoslavia broke up from the position of rights were the dissolution of women's rights, which were structurally made to put women back into the household, away from the public sphere, away from the formal formal work. I forgot that. And again, like I'm going back to it, if we're going back to the construction of gender in our society and even of sex, when we consider sex as a trans-historical thing, we also cannot really talk about the dichotomies of like classical liberal writers, which upon our society still exist. One of the most common dichotomy, and you can see it from different authors seeing it, feminist authors, is the dichotomy where men are societal beings, women are biological beings. It's constantly going through. Like if you consider like the ideas of the social. Why am I missing words right now? The social contract. You can see from Carol Bateman to some of our Yugoslav writers here, even loud femme writers like Catherine McKinnon see it, that there's a constant position where women are put in some kind of a position of being just the biology which should be controlled, and men are those who have agency, who function in society and stuff like that. That's a whole position that goes out of view if we still consider just all of it on the basis of sex. Because I thought about this in a way that those dichotomies work in a way that if you read like classical liberal writers, we're talking about Hobbes, Locke here, or even Kant, or if you go even to Marx, you'll find some of that. If you read Engels, you'll see it in writing there, obviously. But the thing is, I forgot my train of thought at this moment. Sorry, but the thing is, yeah. So from one perspective, you could say that in these types of texts, you can see that men have a gender and women have only a sex, because they're put down on a position of just being a biological fact. And then again, the thing is that this whole notion of women as biological beings and just exclusively biological beings that have sex and stuff like that is a position of nation building. Like, it has its function, it has its ideas, why should it be like that, and it's to provide children for the nation state, to provide the working class for the nation state, to take care of the working class. These all positions had and have still like their function in society and why they're there. Oh, I'm going over my time a little bit. Okay, so what else? Again, when it comes to position of, I was talking about here a bit more about the construction of gender and gender norms and positions in society, but we can read, I'm not going to go in detail about it, but you can also read different writers, especially from the intersex circles, about the construction of sex via gender and how our ideas of gender influence the scientific, biological ideas that we have about sex. I would recommend Anne Fausto Sterling has really interesting texts about it. But the idea here that I'm going through to, and I'm going back to it, is the idea that I think the position and the reason why TERFs got so prominent, because they existed for decades, but right now they're prominent, is the situation of the economic crisis, where capitalism has to go back again to the biological facts, to the gender norms that it needs. The constant precarization of work and flexibilization of work is pushed into the position that the traditional nuclear family has to do it, and it only functions in those dichotomies of men, women, and stuff like that. But again, I would go from a position of empathy here, but it's also a position of a bit, I find it a bit of cynical fact. But when I talked about the situation that we live in sexist societies, I think that a lot of people, from my experience, who I've seen go into the TERF circles are people who usually suffered something from the sexism in our societies. I mean, you can obviously see it. I mean, it's a whole another topic to talk about it. But the thing that I was going back to is, if we're going to consider the political and historical context, I think the anti-gender and anti-gender movement could be, this is a bit controversial, could be considered to be a fascist movement. And I mean, it is, most of it is, and the TERF position is like the feminist wing of it, because it goes back constantly to those anti-gender positions, the biological positions, and it aligns itself with fascist movements. We've seen that. Like, we've seen the LGB Alliance in UK align itself with Heritage Foundation. We've seen people from different organizations, from all of the LGBTI organizations, talking about how they would align themselves and go into coalitions with straight up fascists just to fight against the gender ideology and stuff like that. And also the thing that's a bit of a data point here that I forgot that I had, but we have some contemporary research that shows that transphobia is the entry point for a lot of fascist modern day radicalization. So a lot of young people who go into those fascist stuff right now in the online sphere, obviously where a lot of it happens, one of the first entry points is the transphobia. I mean, if you want to, I put here an example. If you want to consider like the big right-wing talking heads who got popular, a lot of them got popular on the basis of transphobia. If you remember, like, he's everywhere right now, but Jordan Peterson started his whole project of being visible and being fucking everywhere with his transphobia, his real need to misgender his students and to misinterpret like laws in Canada. And also, like, if you know Ben Shapiro, you know him by the phrase of facts don't care about their facts don't care about your feelings. That whole idea came from the idea that biology is fact and trans identity is just a feeling, which is weird. Again, the position which we have here is also why I'm doing this. I call this contemporary analogies, which I'm trying to do analogies between the TERF positions and the contemporary fascist positions, is there's a medicalization involved constantly in here. If you, the ideas of fighting for real biological women, you'll hear it in phrases like, I'll fight for your rights if you prove to me that you're a real woman. From a feminist perspective, you have to be for. It's a type of medicalization because from the context of how they see sex as a biological fact, the way would you prove how that you're a real woman is only through medicalization, through going to medical institutions for them to check about your sex, or if you're going to be banal, showing them your genitals, which would be weird in most social situations. The position, the other thing you can see, like there's a constant back and forth with terms and with ideas between the extreme right and the TERFs. Like I remember a few years ago, the constant talk, I mean, it's still active, is they're transing children, which in the Anglo sphere evolved basically into the ideas here today that you can hear it today. I mean, my organization where I worked was attacked from that position, but you can hear it today about the ideas of grooming children. It's analogous, totally. Like any contact that children have with ideas of gender or something like that is considered grooming, and it got into the laws of different states in the U.S. where any affirmation of trans child's gender is considered to be child abuse. And which brings me back to another broader topic from here. I didn't want to talk about sex work because tomorrow it's going to be sex work, but when we consider the sex work and ideas of sexual violence in the TERF circles, how they're talked about, there's a constant there's a constant calling of the carceral state. So most of the solutions that you hear about in those positions is the state will fix it. When you consider like sexual violence, constantly they're talking about just the prisons and judges and stuff like that. When they're talking about sex work, they're talking about the Nordic model, which is the state through police taking women out of sex work and putting them into the formal marketplace of work. And it's a constant call to the carceral state. There's usually, I've tried to find like positions in those situations where the arbiter of all of it isn't the state. In the instant, like as I said at the start, I'm a communist. I'm not a big believer in the state. My idea is the abolition of state. But the ideas here that you see don't go beyond the ideas of state as an arbiter of everything. Like the state, the state tells you your sex. The state tells you where to work. The state punishes and does, but punishment doesn't like work that good when it comes to sexual violence, but the state does everything. And I'm trying to shorten this, but from the conclusion, I think my conclusion here would be like that there's a lot of this is not a question just about transphobia, about trans people. I think one of the most important things here to talk about is the position and the question of bodily autonomy, which is totally put on the side away, because if we can see like different political movements right now, which started as transphobic and started, I mean, political movements. I'm talking about concretely here nation states which do it, which first started like, as we see in Poland, as we see in Hungary, and as we see in the United States, usually the power on people's bodies started being tested on trans people and queer people and stuff like that. You have in Poland like the LGBT free spaces, and then afterwards you get rid of abortion rights. In the United States, you can have like the grooming, the anti-trans stuff like that, and then federal right of abortion goes away. I mean, that thing I think is the most important question here. What do we do about bodily autonomy? Because if I had more time, I would talk probably about the position even from the position of TERF ideology, do even women have like bodily autonomy? Do they have agency? Because you'll constantly hear like women are biological beings, and again, women who don't prescribe to their ideology are being led away or manipulated or something like that. There's also that question, but I think I'm going to stop here because I've talked a bit longer than I was expected, and I hope I was coherent enough. So, thank you. Did we clap for you? Did we clap for you? I don't know. Dusan, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do we have questions from the audience? Oh, okay. Please just take the microphone.
Okay. Very quickly, actually, I have two questions. So the first one would be, what does it mean heteronormative? You used that word, I think, twice.
Yeah, maybe.
And the second one is, who are TERFs? I didn't get that.
Oh, okay. So I thought that would be the trans. I have a microphone. I don't need another one. Heteronormative would be usually meaning like that you presume that heterosexuality is the norm. But basically, what the word says, heteronormative. There's a norm about presumed heterosexuality. That's basically one of the norms in most of our societies right now. TERFs are the topic of this whole event here today, and it would be, the acronym is Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. So it's a subpart of radical feminism which goes to exclude trans people from their feminism, in an essence. And that was the thing I was talking about the last 20 minutes. So if you have any questions about that, I can repeat.
Well, I might have some questions, but I need some time to formulate probably.
We have microphones and we have some time.
Firstly, thank. Okay, thank you. So you talked about ways to interact with the feminist movement in terms of like working against this whole transphobia, but what about the general like left movement? Like how would you, either of you, like propose ways that we can interact as part of the leftist movement to like change our organizations, like change our inner culture, organizational culture, etc. Because there is the whole different source transphobia there, where some people think that materialism means that you should be biologically essential, etc.
Would you start from the organizational part?
Yeah, I think that you can give a very good theoretical perspective on that. For me, very practical when I speak with people from the left movement. I always say that because there is this position that it's either class struggle or identity struggle. And for me, trans issue is also a class issue. And I think that's very important. Like, so when I speak with my like left fellows, that is something that I usually try to emphasize and discuss around that, because I think that this whole notion that it's either identity politics or class struggle is reductioning the whole struggle that we need to that we are fighting for. And recently I heard an activist in Montenegro that I appreciate a lot, and she said on one panel discussion, she said something that really resonated with me. She said, we don't have the privilege to be driven by ego. And I really think that this is very important now in this moment of any kind of social justice struggle, because we really need to be aware, and I'm not pessimistic. I think that I would not be in activism if I was not optimistic that our struggle has some purpose. But I really think that we need to be aware that we are far less funded than all right movements, that we are far less organized, that we have many discussions which are ongoing within the movement, which they do not have, that we very often lack solidarity that they do not lack, that they are very okay with hierarchy. We are still debating these kind of topics, which I think are very important debates and discussions, but we need to find a way to have them and at the same time work from this disadvantaged position and be better organized, be more efficient, and be less driven by ego.
I mean, I can add a few things there. I mean, first of all, when we say left organizations, it's also a question of, do they consider themselves Marxist? I think that there's a whole here idea that in some way Marxism and trans people don't mix together well, which I would say that it would be a bad reading of Marx there, because like the whole idea of the Marxist philosophical project was the denaturalization of capitalism as it is. And again, if we're talking about identities, where we talked about like there's not really that dichotomy of class or identity or materialism and identity, because identities have their material histories. We know that they have histories, there are structures that form them, there are structures that negate them and stuff like that. It's all pretty material still. That's the thing that I wanted to add here. And I mean, if it really is a position of ego, like their reading of Marx is really bad.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question.
Yeah. One thing came into my mind, and this is the concept that I'm thinking a lot about. It's a concept of allies. I think that I always say allies or saveznici in our language, and it's fine. I appreciate that, but also I appreciate the critic of that concept. And I found a very good critic from one indigenous anarchist collective. And their critic of that concept was that allyship is actually a comfortable position, and we cannot find solidarity in a comfortable position. Solidarity is not comfortable oftentimes. It requires that we are present in being uncomfortable, and they proposed the concept of accomplices. Because of the need for us to be invested in this joint crime against oppressive systems. And I really like that concept. So when we speak about inclusivity, we always speak from this patronizing position that some group is going to include these marginalized people. And I think we need to ditch that. Like, we don't have the privilege not to have all people on board who share our values.
Now you got me an idea that, well, I have something to add again. But yeah, but the position is also constantly like, I forgot to add it here because I forgot it. The position is that we have like, that the basis of politics is like a struggle between two peoples, like two groups constantly, which is in essence that, but it's also, the left struggle shouldn't be the struggle against some type of people, it's a struggle against structures which those people uphold and stuff like that. So I don't see, from my perspective, it's a really weird position to see like being a leftist organization and not being inclusive. I mean, even though inclusivity is a bit of a like a confident position, but why should we not include people who have the same enemy as us, the structures, the patriarchy, the capitalism and stuff like that? It's a weird position. I mean, trans people are also exploited and oppressed by capitalism as everyone else. And it is in capitalism, except the bourgeoisie and stuff like that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think it's a question, are we comrades or not? Like, literally, are we comrades or not? Because that concept of being a comrade is actually something that has a lot of values around that.
Okay, there are other questions we're constantly answering the same one here, sorry.
So, as a trans activist myself and a feminist, sometimes I get asked the question, how can you be a feminist when you murdered the woman or the girl that you were? You removed the girl from society, how can you still be a feminist? And I'm still a bit challenging how I can respond to that. How would you go about answering that question?
I mean, it's an interesting presumption there that feminism is like the position of producing girls or something like that, or the position that feminism is a position that has to, at all costs, keep the idea of a woman that we have already or something like that. Feminism should be, from my perspective, feminism is a political movement that fights against the patriarchy. You're not fighting against the patriarchy by like preserving women. You're fighting against the patriarchy so women and men and trans people, non-binary people, every people. I don't know why I'm constantly telling the word people, but you're fighting against a structure. You're fighting against power. You're not fighting for an identity. You're fighting against the power which will help you live whatever your identity you want. So that thing is, I mean, there's a dose of essentialism there, isn't it? Like where we have to, feminism has to like, feminism is not a museum for women. It's a fight. I mean, that's the first thing that I've got there to answer. If you want to add.
I didn't actually hear the question. I was bringing us water.
It's an interesting question.
So the question is, since I'm a trans activist and a feminist, I get asked quite frequently, how can you still be a feminist when you murdered the girl that you were? You removed the girl from society. How can you still believe in feminism?
The Apprentice.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think of all the things that I find problematic in this question. Yeah, I know. I understand. I've heard so many problematic questions like that in my life, and I'm not sure how to answer them anymore. I was asked by some feminists why didn't you just like remain a girl and found a way to navigate through society? And I really can't find a better answer than I just couldn't. Some answers are very simple, because I always, like, when I speak with people and I ask them, like, how do you know that you're a man or a woman? People start, at first they start rationalizing. Well, I have these parts, I know, I was taught by my parents or society and stuff like that. But I think that when you remove all these answers, you literally just have a simple answer. I just am. And I'm really curious, why are we constantly asking trans people, but we're also constantly asking women to justify themselves and our own existence? When I speak with people when I speak with people coming from the TERF movement, I always say to them, I really believe that you're actually damaging women. You're damaging trans people, but you're also damaging women, because you're damaging women in a way that you're promoting the narrative that there is a certain way that women should look, that there is a certain way a woman should behave, and we should, by now, at least in the movement, we should be past this.
There's a certain way that a woman's body should be. Also.
Exactly. So when we speak about all these things, I think that we should also have in mind, this is not only damaging. This is not only damaging trans people. It's not only a matter of my life. It's a matter of many lives who are not sharing my identity.
Honestly, I don't know, it's
No, I wanted to ask, the conversation about identity politics is unfortunately becoming very Americanized, especially, well, back home in Malta sometimes. Do you think this is, and on the online world as well, do you think this is more of a hindrance, the fact that you have privileged celebrities almost speaking on behalf of trans people and the queer community?
It's a very interesting question. If I understood it correctly, you're asking, is it now that narrative coming from, which is Western narrative, very individualistic, is actually privileging certain people to speak about? But do you mean certain? They don't really represent the community. But who are trans and queer, or who are not trans and queer? Say, I don't know, Yeah, I think that, but that is actually what I think I said. Trans issue is also a class issue. I know for a fact that some Black and Latino trans people who are now famous are still representing the community, and I also know that some people are. I generally have a problem with this one person representing the community. I think that's individualistic. Like, for example, in Montenegro, when media shares what I said, or when I'm like in some kind of social media discussion, people usually say, or media says, like, a representative of a trans community. I'm not a representative of a trans community. I'm a trans man from a small town representing myself. And I always try to emphasize that, but it's not enough, because people have this like correlations with other people who are like you. And I was one of the candidates for a council of a public broadcaster, and I had an interview in the parliament, and they asked me different questions, and they were putting a discussion in a way that I was going to contribute to the public broadcaster to have LGBTI issues more involved in the program of public broadcaster. And I said to them, okay, you know, I am trans and I bring a specific perspective, but I also have some hobbies, you know, like I'm a biologist, and I have a national identity, I have a political identity, and I can tell you about my life, like what I like to do in my free time. And I think that this is the narrative that we also need more. Especially in the movement. I don't want to be that trans guy in the leftist movement who can educate us on trans issues, on how to include trans people in the left. I don't care about that. I want to contribute to trans people being included, but I also want to write and speak about different issues which are not only connected to me being trans. I often use personal experience, but mostly to share, because I like to connect, and I think this is the baseline of activism. If we are not doing left, feminist, anti-war activism for the sake of connection, I think we can always rationalize and say we are doing it for the justice, we're doing it for equality, equity, and stuff like that, but I think the baseline of all that is actually connection. So in order to connect with people, I'm using a personal story, but I also have some hobbies and political ideas that I care about.
Hi, first of all, thank you very much. I have so many comments in my head that I won't say right now because then we would have another hour. But I have a question where, because you both talked about basically talking to TERFs and dealing with a lot of stuff and questions and whatever. It's same for me in Germany with there's a lot of TERFs, especially in the city I live in. It's very difficult for me to do feminist or queer feminist work. And to a lot of, a lot of times it's overlapping also with the lesbian community I know, unfortunately, also with the communist community, interestingly. And there is this, you'd already talked about this predator coming in our bathroom, idea of people are actually afraid of something. And especially with the lesbian community, who's the overlapping of lesbian TERF community, they are there's an actual, they're actually afraid that lesbian women will basically die out because society is training lesbian women that they should become men, so they're fitting into the heteronormative thing again. And it is very wild to me, and I don't want to compare it in the terms that it's actually like that. But when I talk to people about this, I get the same feeling of an existential threat, like when I talk to gay people about the AIDS crisis, which was an actual existential threat. And people were so afraid of what's happening. And these people feel the same way, just that it's, in my opinion, not actually a thing. And I don't really know how to talk about that, because everything I can say is just, that's not true. It's not a predator in your bathroom. It's not that lesbians dying out because of that. And I would like to hear what you say to that, how you deal with that in your activism.
I mean, oh, okay. Oh. So there's also the idea that transitioning is like this there. So you're not gonna be a lesbian one day and tomorrow you're a trans man, and that's it. So there's also this idea where you have to talk about, I mean, they have to meet trans people. That's one of the things that helps in those situations. You're not going to, I mean, I've always found that the idea that we are training gay people to become trans weird, because it isn't hard enough to transition already in society. We're doing it right now just to remove gay people out of society or something like that. I have no idea how to go from there, because I'm not a lesbian woman, so I cannot speak in their name. But it is from my perspective, it looks like a propaganda thing, constructing an enemy, a fear, which you can politically use for some purpose. But usually, I mean, do you have, I mean, it's vague, but you have to find some way to like just show that those anxieties have no real basis. Those enemies don't exist. Like, people aren't transitioning to go into women's bathrooms. People aren't transitioning to go into women's sports. That who has the motivation for that? I mean, who has the motivation to be a professional sport person, like, and then also transition doing that? I mean, those are some fears that are constantly evoked and being provoked for political gain, for political situations. And I don't know how to directly talk to it because it's still, like, it's abstract. It's right now, it's a story I know from you. I don't know. How does it look in the community there? What's going on and stuff like that. But it's a way of finding the position to remove that specter that's haunting lesbians, like the penis coming to get them, or the transition turning them into a trans man or something like that. I mean, I don't know. You probably have something better to say there.
No, but for me, the question is, do we have less lesbians? No, we do not. The movement is more visible than ever, and we have. I think that the lesbian and in general women community in the queer movement has experienced many years of invisibility in many countries. I don't like to generalize, but I think in many countries, including my own, women were not so visible because of many things, especially because of oppressive systems which were in place, but were a very important and active part of the movement. And I think now there is a growing visibility of lesbian community and actually diverse lesbian community, which is taking a place and something to be proud of. So that is my question. Do we have less lesbians? I really think that we do not have less lesbians. I also think that we do not have a bigger trans community. I think that we have more visible trans community because of the work that we have done.
The stock of lesbians ran out a few years ago, and now there's less of them.
Is this working? Yeah, okay. Hello, my name is Tamara. Thank you very much for everything you said. It was really encouraging. I have a question. Actually, it's more of a comment for the organizers, but actually it's connected to question for the organizers, to the panelists. So when I was coming here, I was thinking about, okay, now we have a panel about transphobia, and it is all male panel. We do not have representatives of trans women. And I feel that we sort of lacked of the voices of trans women, but that's of course not to you. Maybe organizers can say something about it. But the question to you is, actually, we were talking about transphobia, but in my knowledge and experience, TERF's like advocacy is usually against trans women because they perceive them as pervert men. So my question to both of you is, do you think, is there any difference and which difference in experiencing discrimination and transphobia between trans men and trans women, and what is that difference? Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'll start here. First,
It's a question for you.
For me, it's very important to state that I'm fully aware of my, first of all, passing privilege, because when you look at me and you don't know me, you would think that I will attack Pride on Saturday. And I think that is a huge privilege and also a result of defense mechanism of growing in Podgorica in Montenegro. For me, this is very important to state because I think that also it gives me a huge responsibility that if I go first in some spaces, I believe that it is my responsibility to spread them. I know fierce trans women who are leftist in this country. And I spoke on a panel today with one of them, I really find them as a huge inspiration. I think that I know how it was hard for me to get into some spaces and not to be that trans guy. I think I'm still that trans guy in many spaces. But also I think when I say a responsibility and when I think from a perspective of leftist, I must think also from the perspective of solidarity and sharing resources. And for me that means not only sharing material resources, but sharing resources as space, sharing resources as opportunity to speak. And it took me 10 years to get to the point where I get invited in some events. And this is also a rare opportunity that I get invited from people who are invested in academia. I think that is also one of the spaces which has started spreading for trans people. And I always remember one sentence that one trans woman from Montenegro said, it took me a lot of time to be aware of all the oppression that I experienced as a trans woman. And then it took me the same amount of time to be aware of the oppression that I experienced as a woman. And that is something that I think is very important, because in Podgorica she was beaten several times. I was never beaten. But as I said, I look like a hooligan. I have 2 very big dogs. And also I'm very visible, which gives me, in Montenegro, it gives me a certain circle of protection so far.
This is gonna get much worse right now because I'm a cis man. I'm a cis straight man here talking about this, but I found. Really?
I wasn't trying to exclude you.
No, but I think.
But he should show resilience to that.
Last time I said this, the whole room went boo. But the thing, when it comes to visibility, there's an interesting the thing here with TERFs, like usually attack trans women, and most of the time, which isn't even a better thing than that, trans men are invisible to them most of the time, except when they think of it as women escaping patriarchy. They think of trans men as women who are trying to escape the misogyny of our societies, which is again a weird motivation to transition. Like you're gonna stop being, the misogyny is gonna stop, but the transphobia is here behind the door. Like it's a weird concept, but that's the way I've seen them. Like their difference when it comes to the. I'm talking about TERFs here. I don't know the experience of a trans person and stuff like that. I'm just talking how they position themselves to those 2 identities and the differences where they position themselves. Like men are predators, men are perverts and stuff like that. Women who transition are just escaping patriarchy for them. That's the difference there. And usually trans men even don't exist in their worldview. They don't see them. They don't talk about them that much. I mean, you probably noticed that usually you're invisible in that kind of context when they talk about it, except in those situations of escaping the patriarchy.
Yes, this is very important because, for example, feminist spaces for me were very important here. Sorry. Yeah, I see you. Feminist spaces for me were very important spaces for healing, It was not male spaces. It was feminist spaces. And I also did a lot of kako se kaže pravdanje? Pravdanje, kao opravdavanje. Yeah, I did a lot of justifying of what am I doing in these feminist spaces. And you reminded me of this. I wouldn't, because now I feel them as very comfortable and as my own, but this is a very very important part of that experience. Yeah.
How did I remind you of that?
With this invisibility.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to answer you. Thank you for your remark. I asked a few trans women to participate, but for different reasons they couldn't. That's the first thing. We had limited resources and time to organize all this. Tomorrow we have an all-female panel where we will continue to talk a little about transphobia as well, because Karolina Hrga is also dealing a lot with that issue.
And Nina also.
And Nina Džolović as well. So we will have women speaking tomorrow on transphobia as well.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no further questions, I would like to thank you all for participating and invite you. Tomorrow we are going to talk on sex work with two women from Croatia, Karolina Hrga and Milica Džolović. And Nina Džolović, sorry. Yeah, Nina Džolović. You can find their abstracts online, what they are going to talk about, and the session starts at the same time as today, 5 p.m. and you're all very welcome to come again and participate. Thank you very much.